Mercedes has made big changes to its F1 technical lineup, with James Allison returning to a hands-on role in a job swap with Mike Elliott. Scott and Ed are here to discuss this with me. And Scott, what do you make of this? And is it an admission, perhaps, that Mercedes had the wrong man in the job previously?
It's an admission sort of from the team, but also from Elliott himself, because it's Elliott who has instigated this review of the Mercedes technical structure, whether they have the right people in the right places, are they getting the most out of everybody in the organisation. I think Elliott was the right man for Mercedes, just perhaps maybe not in the right position. He has been there for a very long time. He's held some very significant roles. His background is in aerodynamics. You would think in the ground effect era that would make him the perfect person to have is in a technical director role. But I think his strengths. I think he was technology director before he had that promotion to replace the upward moving James Allison. As technology director, he did have a broader remit. In hindsight, maybe a bit less well suited to the technical director role than was hoped for. And I think that explains why he's not been jettisoned from the organisation entirely. That job swap, he moves into the CTO role because I think that does suit him a little bit better, a bit less day-to-day management pressure, a bit less of picking the right concepts and making sure people are working in the right areas, but broader visions, broader decisions on technologies and working practices and exactly how you split your time and effort on resources for the 2026 car, for example. I think that all plays to Mike Elliott and his strengths a bit better. But I guess he would say that because this has, in a way, he's kind of engineered a promotion for himself in quite a difficult time for the team.
I think it's also the culmination of a fairly long process of realising it wasn't working. Mercedes were very keen to let this part of the season play out, see how good or bad the car actually is. They had an inkling over the winter. I think they hadn't made enough progress. That's been borne out on track. And I think it's not just Elliott realising that, it's the wider team. And you can use terms about success or failure. Well, ultimately, it is a failure in the job, but it isn't a question of is someone brilliant or an idiot. He's clearly very, very capable and able, and the car is quick. It's just not quick enough. So I think it's just recognising that that car concept that he was attached to hasn't ultimately worked, and just realising that you need to shuffle things around a little bit to get the best out of what you've got.
I have to say, I'm getting sort of Red Bull 2010s vibes from this. We always used to hear about how Adrian Newey wanted to step back from F1, be less hands-on involved, and then Red Bull would have a bad car that needed fixing, and then we'd hear that Newey was coming back and he was back more involved. Now, in fairness, I don't think that was ever quite as official as this. You didn't get a full-on job change and job swap. But there is a similar vibe here that now Mercedes is the fallen giant who needs to go back to the guy who led its technical team when they were doing all the winning to come and rescue the day.
It does illustrate how profoundly difficult it is to manage your succession. Succession planning is often talked about, rarely executed that well, because on paper, everything was right with this. Elliott had been there since 2012, longer than James Allison. In fact, he'd been an absolutely key player throughout, whether it's as head of aero or as technology director. And so he was the absolutely ideal successor because he knew the team inside out. He was very, very capable. Everything looked perfectly controlled, perfectly stage managed, perfectly timed, and it hasn't worked. And that just underlines how difficult it is to be sure exactly how things should work with this. He earned that role, but it hasn't quite worked out. And you would think it should be absolutely ideal because you don't want to bring in some third party who's not been involved because they'll create ructions. But there's no perfect way to do this. Often the ideal succession just isn't quite right. Partly because everybody was in their right sort of positions in the first place. And I think, as Scott's already alluded to, this does put Elliott back into the kind of position that he was better at, better equipped in terms of his overall skill set, even though it's nominally a more senior position. So, yeah, really tough business succession. And if you're someone like James Allison or Adrian Newey, you're very, very difficult to replace because it's such a fundamentally complex job, both in terms of how much you've got to keep track of and the input you make, your character, the way you approach the job.
Especially when a person like that wants to move into a different position. You know, that was this initial restructuring when Allison moved away from being technical director and was moved into the newly created chief technical officer role. That was because he didn't want to be technical director anymore, especially on those terms. I think it had been very, very intense. He came into that organisation at a time where Mercedes were going head to head with Ferrari for the World Championship in 17 and 18, and then 19 was incredibly stressful. Different little rule changes within that as well, and I think it took a lot out of him. He moved into a role with, broader responsibilities, but also a 3-day working week instead of being at the coalface every single day, managing the stresses of a current campaign. So I think that move away was what James Allison needed at the time. It gave Mercedes chance to do a bit of a refresh of the technical structure, but it also gave Allison, I think, chance to reflect a little bit. He talked at the time about feeling very aware of the fact that senior technical personnel in F1 have a shelf life. And the implication was he was worried he was getting to the end of his and wanted to leave before he did. I think what he's worked out now is actually that shelf life isn't as perhaps looming aggressively as he thought it was, which will be in part because this new structure has a CTO in place. It will be Elliott now instead of Allison, but it means that Allison's a different kind of technical director, focusing on the day-to-day without having to worry about the bigger picture stuff as much, because Elliott is there taking place of that. So I think it gives him not a new lease of life. I think that would probably be overstating it slightly, but I think it's a chance for Allison to reflect on whether he's willing to be technical director again, working under the person he was previously just in charge of and had reporting to him. So it's something that I think, certainly at least for the short term, works for Allison, even if it doesn't really change Mercedes' short-term outlook that much.
What is that short-term outlook then? Where and when are we going to see the difference that these changes are going to make?
I don't think that this is something that really drastically changes Mercedes' prospects for 2023. Ultimately, it's on a design development direction now that is different. That has been something that they've been working on and working towards for weeks, actually even really before the season opener in Bahrain, maybe even before the first test in Bahrain. There's been a bit of emotion and maybe a little bit of exaggeration on how suddenly Mercedes realised it was in trouble at the first race of the season. So they've been plotting this direction change for a while. Elliott fed into that. Allison fed into that because when he was CTO, it wasn't like he just had nothing to do with Formula One anymore. So these changes, I understand, have been in place for a few weeks already. They've been working in these positions, but it's a longer term change. It isn't about suddenly coming up with a new development direction for 23, suddenly speeding up upgrades or making the 23 car a second a lap faster. It'd be lovely if they did, but I don't really see that happening. It's all about longer term planning, making sure that this technical structure is as strong as it can possibly be for the future. And that starts with Mercedes making sure it doesn't drop the ball on the 2024 car as well.
It's also going to be important to have in mind, as upgrades appear in the near future, that this is part of a longer term project. For example, there's a much vaunted upgrade at Imola that's part of the change to a new direction, but only a small part of that step. Mike Elliott actually has been a big part of that. He talked about the fact that at Imola they'll have modified side pods that required some work under the skin to make them fit. Side pods that aren't a complete change, but are also a slight deviation from what they've got so far. So it's a very, very long transition. And as Scott pointed out, it's going to be next year that the full impact of this change is felt, because what's coming over the coming months is very much part of what was done on Elliott's watch. And I suspect it should deliver performance improvement.